We all know the Battle of Crait is just a copy of the Battle of Hoth. Everybody knows that. What hasn't been done is standing the two battles side by side, decision by decision, and measuring what was lost in the copying. So that's what this is. Walker against walker, speeder against speeder, defense grid against nothing, character sacrifice against character sacrifice. Whether you think Star Wars declined with the prequels or the sequels, Crait is the clearest case study in what happens when you replicate a battle without understanding why the original worked. Start at the tactical foundation, because that's where the gap is largest. After destroying the Death Star at the Battle of Yavin, the Rebel Alliance needed a new headquarters deep enough in the outer reaches to disappear from Imperial search parties. They chose Hoth, inhospitable, remote, barely worth scanning. An ice planet so hostile that the rebels sent out daily reconnaissance patrols to check for life signs, because the environment killed nearly everything that didn't prepare for it. Echo Base was built into a network of ice caves, developed into a functioning military installation, and defended with 2 layers of infrastructure that would define the battle's entire logic. The first layer, a DSS-02 shield generator, producing an 80-kilometer-wide deflector field around the base. One function, block orbital bombardment. Not slow it down, not reduce it, block it entirely. The Empire Strikes Back states this directly through in-scene dialogue. The field is strong enough to deflect any bombardment. That line isn't there for atmosphere. It's the first domino in a chain of tactical consequences that creates everything the audience is about to watch. The second layer, a V-150 Planet Defender surface-to-orbit ion cannon, capable of firing coordinated salvos at Star Destroyers in the blockade above Hoth. Its function wasn't to destroy ships, it was to disable them temporarily, knock their systems offline long enough to punch a window in the Imperial blockade, through which the GR-75 transport ships could escape. Shield holds the Empire on the ground. Ion cannon clears the sky. Transports escape through the window. That's the rebel plan at Hoth, in 3 steps, and every element of the battle sequence flows downstream from those 3 steps. When an Imperial probe droid found Echo Base, Vader moved the fleet immediately. Admiral Ozzel commanded the approach, and his decision about how to enter the system cost the Empire the only tactical option that mattered. Ozzel brought the fleet out of light speed too close to the Hoth system. The proximity triggered the rebels' early warning sensors and gave them time to activate the DSS-02 generator before the Empire could position for an orbital strike. The window for bombardment closed in minutes. Vader had Ozzel executed on the bridge, promoted Captain Piet in the same breath, literally while Ozzel was still choking, because the blunder didn't just alert the rebels, it eliminated the clean option. The orbital bombardment that would have ended the Rebel Alliance at Hoth in under a minute was now impossible for the duration of the engagement. Ozzel's execution isn't a moment of Vader menace isolated from the plot. It's a causal event. His death explains why General Veers received orders to land AT-AT walkers outside the shield perimeter and march them overland to the power generator. The Empire's entire ground assault exists because one admiral made one tactical error that activated one defensive layer. That chain of causation runs without a gap, from the probe droid's discovery to the last GR-75 transport clearing the blockade. Veers followed his orders precisely. Land beyond the 80-kilometer shield boundary. March the walkers overland. Destroy the power generator. His objective wasn't to kill rebels or capture the base, it was the generator, because destroying the generator dropped the shield, which reopened the orbital bombardment option and ended the ground battle. Every Imperial action during Hoth was organized around undoing the rebels' defensive architecture. This is why the Battle of Hoth looks the way it does. The white expanse between the shield perimeter and Echo Base, the distance the AT-ATs had to cross on foot, isn't a directorial choice about visual drama. It's the tactical consequence of an 80-kilometer deflector field. Ralph McQuarrie's image of walkers approaching through a snowstorm, slowly, inevitably, growing larger against the white, exists because the shield forced the Empire to land outside its range and walk the assault in. Remove the DSS-02 generator from the screenplay, and the Empire fires from orbit in 60 seconds. The battle ceases to exist. The image never appears. The Resistance base on Crait was an abandoned rebellion facility. Bail Organa had originally scouted the planet, a remote mineral world, white salt over red crystal, barely inhabitable, as a potential hideout decades before the events of The Last Jedi. By 34 ABY, when the Resistance arrived with their fleet reduced to a single capital ship after sustained First Order pursuit from Dakar, they occupied whatever remained of that old installation. An access corridor, a large interior space, equipment of uncertain vintage, and a large steel door separating the interior from the salt flat outside. No DSS-02 shield generator. No ion cannon. No surface-to-orbit weapons. No orbital defense grid of any kind appears in any source covering the Battle of Crait. The complete list of what stood between the Resistance and the First Order at Crait is that steel door. The First Order's deployment was as follows: 11 ATM-6 heavy walkers, 2 standard AT-ATs, 1 Upsilon-class command shuttle for Kylo Ren, TIE fighters, AT-STS, and a super laser siege cannon, a battering ram towed by a pair of AT-HH heavy haulers, specifically constructed to breach heavy fortifications. The battering ram cannon was brought to Crait for one purpose: punch through the steel door. The question the film declines to answer: why didn't the First Order's Star Destroyers handle that from orbit? There is no orbital deflector shield at Crait. There is no planetary defense grid. There is nothing blocking energy bombardment from above. The First Order fleet was in position. Standard Star Destroyers are capable of surface bombardment independently of superweapons. That capability doesn't require Starkiller Base, which had been destroyed in the previous film. No canonical source, no Rian Johnson interview, no official tie-in material provides an explanation for why the First Order's orbital assets stood down while a siege cannon was towed across a salt flat toward a steel door. At Hoth, the absence of orbital bombardment has a specific, on-screen mechanical explanation that the film delivers before the audience can ask the question. One line of dialogue. Then every subsequent action in the battle makes sense. At Crait, the First Order chooses a ground assault over orbital bombardment for no reason the film articulates, and the visual premise of the entire sequence, walkers advancing across a white plain toward a rebel base, is borrowed from Hoth without the mechanism that made it logical. The surface of a Hoth battle is reproduced. The structural logic that created that surface is absent. Ralph McQuarrie designed the AT-AT for The Empire Strikes Back using four-legged, stable geometry. Approximately 20 meters tall. Blast-impervious armor plating heavy enough that snowspeeder laser cannons were ineffective against the frontal hull in the opening minutes of the Hoth engagement. The head unit carried the walker's primary weapons, and the cockpit where General Veers personally commanded the ground assault. The body carried troops. The four legs carried everything. The design communicates its own threat. The silhouette, four legs, long neck, boxy armored body, reads as inevitable from any distance. You understand what it is immediately. You understand that it can't be stopped by conventional weapons because its geometry suggests armor from every direction. You understand that it will reach Echo Base unless something changes, because it's walking there, and nothing the rebels have appears to be slowing it down. When a line of AT-ATs emerges from the Hoth snowstorm and begins crossing the plain, the audience has grasped the tactical situation without a word of explanation. The design is doing the storytelling. The vulnerability is equally readable. Four-legged geometry means 4 points of contact with the ground, and legs are narrower than hulls. A cable wrapped around them could, theoretically, destabilize a machine that depends on 4-point ground contact to stay upright. When Luke Skywalker, in a snowspeeder under fire, his cannons bouncing off the AT-AT's armor, his pilot options running out, looked at his aircraft's harpoon gun and tow cable and proposed the cable tactic, it was legible as a solution the moment he named it. Of course the legs. Of course the cable. The AT-AT's design made the answer visible before Luke said it out loud. The execution wasn't clean. Wedge Antilles and gunner Wes Jansen circled an AT-AT, fired the harpoon into its leg, and began looping the cable across its feet as Wedge banked in tight passes around the moving target. The Walker fired. The snowspeeder banked under the shots. After several passes, the cable was wound tight enough that the Walker lost its footing and fell. They blew it up in its weakened state. One Walker down. The tactic worked. It also cost aircraft and, eventually, lives. Luke's snowspeeder was shot down before he could complete a similar run. His gunner, Dak, had been killed in the cockpit earlier. Killed while Luke was still flying, the battle barely minutes old. Luke flew the final approach with a dead man behind him, his speeder trailing smoke. When it crashed, he crawled out of the wreckage and continued on foot, which tells you what kind of sequence this is. He found a downed AT-AT nearby, cut into its belly plating with his lightsaber, dropped a thermal detonator into the crew compartment, and got clear before it detonated. The Walker exploded from the inside. That improvisation worked by a margin the film makes feel narrow and expensive, and the shield generator was destroyed by Veers anyway, in the lead AT-AT, advancing on his objective while the snowspeeder engagement occupied the flanks. The tow cable sequence cost Dak his life, cost Luke his aircraft, brought down one Walker by cable and a second from the inside, and changed nothing about the outcome of the battle. Hoth was lost. The improvisation was real, the price was real, and it still wasn't enough. Working with design supervisor Kevin Jenkins, Rian Johnson created the AT-M6 for The Last Jedi with a documented goal: make the original AT-AT look small by comparison, specifically to make the classic Walker look puny, more like its Kenner toy version. The AT-M6 is built around a Mega Caliber 6 turbolaser, a heavy artillery cannon large enough that the Walker's entire front section was redesigned to accommodate it. The front limbs are bent forward in a gorilla knuckle configuration, angled into the ground specifically to lower and stabilize the Walker's mass when the turbolaser fires. The design solves an engineering problem created by putting a very large gun on a moving platform. Coverage of the AT-M6 ran under the headline, Star Wars. That time Rian Johnson thought he could make a better AT-AT, which identifies the design's core problem more precisely than any visual breakdown can. The goal was to surpass the original. What Johnson got was a machine that looks assembled around its weapon, rather than coherent as a fighting vehicle. The AT-AT's design is subtractive, the minimum architecture needed to carry that threat across the plane. The AT-M6's design is additive. Every element in the silhouette is doing something visible and specific, and the accumulation of visible engineering decisions makes the machine harder to read as a simple threat. The AT-AT gets more frightening the longer you look at it, because the simplicity registers as inevitability. The AT-M6 gets more confusing the longer you look, because there are too many decisions in the silhouette, and you're analyzing the engineering when you should be afraid of the machine. The deeper problem is structural rather than aesthetic. At Hoth, the AT-AT was the tactical problem the entire Rebel response was organized around. The snowspeeder sortie existed to deal with the Walkers. Luke's assault existed to deal with a Walker. Veers piloted the lead Walker and personally destroyed the shield generator from inside it. The vehicle was the story at every level of the engagement. At Crait, 11 AT-M6s advanced on the resistance base, and the gate was breached by the separate siege cannon. The Walkers were fire support. They provided cover and suppression, while the battering ram did the actual tactical work. No resistance pilot devised a solution specific to the AT-M6's design. Nobody wrapped a cable around the gorilla knuckle legs. Nobody targeted the Mega Caliber turbolaser mount as a specific vulnerability. No character decision at Crait was shaped by the AT-M6's particular engineering, the way Luke's decision was shaped by the AT-AT's four-legged geometry. The gorilla knuckle configuration is a real engineering solution to a real problem: stabilizing a very large gun on a moving platform. Coherent design. The Battle of Crait ignores it completely. The legs go untargeted, unremarked, and unchallenged through the entire engagement. Johnson built a more complicated vehicle and gave it less to do than the machine it was designed to replace. The T-47 airspeeder started as a civilian airspeeder. The Rebel Alliance modified it for cold weather operation on Hoth, converting a repurposed civilian craft into something that could operate in temperatures that would kill an unprotected human in minutes. The harpoon gun and tow cable that became the tactical solution at Hoth were standard T-47 equipment. The rebels brought them to Hoth because the T-47 came with them, not because anyone anticipated using them against 4-story armored walkers. That origin is part of the sequence's meaning. Luke Skywalker, in the opening minutes of an engagement where his cannons weren't working and his pilots were dying, connected the standard equipment his aircraft already carried to the mechanical vulnerability of the enemy machine he was flying against. The solution is credible because it's specific, a particular tool used against a particular weakness in a particular way, and because the tool was already there for a different reason. Nobody designed a weapon to fight AT-ATs. Luke repurposed standard equipment under fire and made it work, at a cost the film tracks in exact terms. Dak died in Luke's cockpit before Luke completed the approach. Luke flew solo from that point on. Wedge and Jansen's cable run succeeded, but expended their aircraft in the process. Luke's speeder was shot down. The tow cable tactic brought down one walker and bought evacuation time, and the shield generator was destroyed anyway, and the battle was lost. The rebels paid in lives to discover the limits of what improvisation could accomplish against that assault. The emotional weight of the sequence rests on that accounting. The ingenuity and the price are both made visible. The Resistance dispatched 13 V-4XD ski speeders from the Crait base, ultralight, low-altitude craft with reinforced windshields and open cockpits. Each one had a single ski-like strut that dragged along the surface for stability, because the craft apparently couldn't maintain steady flight without it. The V-4XD was old, found in the abandoned rebel base, pressed into service because it was what the Resistance had available. When the 13 speeders accelerated onto the salt flat, the ski legs scraped through the white surface crust and exposed the red mineral crystal underneath. 13 lines of deep red spread behind the craft as they moved toward the first order line. The image is genuinely striking, one of the more visually inventive shots in the film. 13 brushstrokes of red against absolute white, moving in parallel across a flat that seems to have no edge. Poe Dameron led the sortie and recognized within minutes that the speeder's weapons were ineffective. He called a retreat. The cannon fired. The door was breached. 13 V-4XD ski speeders produced a visual and returned. None destroyed a target. None devised a tactic specific to the siege cannon's mechanics or the AT-M6's design. No Resistance pilot made a decision during the ski speeder sortie that changed the outcome of the engagement. The speeders were sacrificial diversionary craft, and the battle registered their sacrifice in no tactical terms. The in-universe explanation is accurate. The Resistance used these speeders because they were the only aircraft in the abandoned base, and the Resistance had nothing else. That's documented. It's also the identical premise as the Hoth snowspeeders, repurposed or salvaged equipment pressed into a battle against overwhelming odds. The T-47 was a modified civilian airspeeder. The V-4XD was a derelict from a facility abandoned decades earlier. Same premise, opposite execution. At Hoth, limited resources forced a creative solution specific to the enemy's mechanical vulnerability. At Crait, limited resources produced 13 craft that flew toward the enemy and retreated without result. One sequence establishes that improvisation can beat doctrine when it's specific enough. The other establishes that improvisation can also just fail. That second proposition isn't wrong. It's a true thing about war. But the ski speeder sequence presents itself with the same tonal weight and structural positioning as the snowspeeder sequence. It hits the same beats. It reaches for the same emotional register. The salt trails look extraordinary. They don't mean anything the tow cable sequence meant, because the tactical specificity and the cost that matters are both absent. Before the Rose and Finn scene, Map what Hoth does with character-level risk, because the contrast is precise. Han Solo went into the Hoth tundra alone, before the battle started, to find Luke, missing, presumed dead in the wilderness. The base couldn't spare anyone. The evacuation was already in progress. The Imperial fleet was closing. Every personnel decision carried weight. Han went anyway, into temperatures the film establishes will kill an unprotected human in minutes. He found Luke nearly frozen in the snow, improvised a shelter from a dead Tauntaun, kept Luke alive through the night, and got both of them back to the base before the Imperial assault began. The risk ran in two directions simultaneously. Failing to find Luke meant Luke died, and succeeding meant delaying his own escape from a base about to face a ground assault. He succeeded, and both men survived. During the ground battle itself, Rebel soldiers held positions in hastily dug trenches backed by fixed heavy weapons, snowtroopers and ATAT fire coming at them across the open plain. Their weapons couldn't stop the walkers. Their function was to hold the line long enough for the evacuation transports to cycle through the ion cannon window. The film doesn't name most of these soldiers. It doesn't need to. The visual logic of the sequence communicates their situation. Infantry with hand weapons in trenches, 4-story armored machines advancing toward them, and communicates it clearly enough. Luke's arc within the battle covers 3 distinct phases across roughly 40 minutes of screen time. Rogue Leader, flying attack pattern Delta against AT-AT armor that his weapons couldn't penetrate, recognizing the tactical failure and improvising the cable solution in real time. Downed Pilot, after his speeder was shot and crashed, his gunner dead behind him, his aircraft destroyed, continuing on foot through an active combat zone. Improvising Combatant, who cut into the belly of a grounded AT-AT with a lightsaber and destroyed it from the inside when no other option remained. Each phase leads to a consequence that the battle tracks. Attack pattern Delta fails, establishing the problem. The cable tactic works at a cost. The AT-AT assault from the inside works by a margin that looks genuinely narrow, and the shield generator is destroyed anyway because Veers was advancing on it the entire time, and the rebel decisions in the snowspeeder engagement couldn't prevent that. Nobody at Hoth stopped another character from making a sacrifice. Nobody interrupted a tactical decision to deliver a philosophical argument. Characters acted within the battle's constraints and lived or died by those actions. That is the structural principle the Rose and Finn scene inherits, and then dismantles. Finn identified the battering ram cannon as the decisive weapon at Crait. The cannon was positioned to fire on the Resistance's steel door, the last physical barrier between the First Order and the handful of survivors inside the base. He turned his V-4XD ski speeder around and committed to a kamikaze attack run, full acceleration, directly at the cannon, with the intention of destroying it at the cost of his own life. The film frames his approach as a sacrifice worth making. The shot composition, the scoring, the speed, the intercutting, every production choice in those seconds positions the audience to understand that what Finn is doing matters, that it might change the outcome, that it will cost him everything. The film commits to that reading of his run. This commitment isn't incidental. It's necessary for everything that follows to carry emotional weight. Rose Tico crashed her speeder into his. She stopped him. The cannon fired. The door was breached. Rose then delivered a speech about saving what we love rather than fighting what we hate. Rian Johnson's stated intent for this sequence is documented. It was designed to serve as a pivot point for Finn's arc, introducing an extra layer of moral complexity to his understanding of what the Resistance was fighting for. Those are Johnson's words from interviews. He wanted the scene to complicate Finn's character development. The mechanism he built to accomplish that was a physical collision, followed by a philosophical speech. Here is the mechanical structure of what that built. A character attempts a potentially decisive sacrifice. A second character physically prevents that sacrifice to deliver an argument. The tactical objective the sacrifice was aimed at fails regardless of either character's action. The speech is delivered while that failure is occurring in the background. The character who delivered the speech is carried unconscious from the battlefield. The character who was stopped survives. The stated purpose of the sequence, complicating Finn's moral understanding, produces no visible consequence in the film's remaining runtime. The film's framing commits to Finn's run as meaningful. That commitment is what creates the scene's structural problem. If the run was meaningful, if the film is asking the audience to believe that Finn was about to accomplish something, then stopping it was consequential, and the speech that replaced the sacrifice's potential outcome has to answer for that consequence. If the run was hopeless, and the framing is misleading the audience, the scene has different problems. The film doesn't resolve this contradiction. It frames the run as real, stops it, delivers the speech, breaches the door, and continues. The audience is left with a sequence that positioned itself as emotionally decisive, and then failed to connect that positioning to anything that follows. No moment at Hoth operates on that structure. Han's decision to go find Luke wasn't interrupted. The trench soldiers weren't stopped from holding their positions. Luke's assault on the AT-AT wasn't redirected by a teammate who crashed into his path to explain why a different kind of fighting mattered more. The emotional architecture of Hoth's character beats rests on a principle the film never states but never violates. Decisions have consequences. Sacrifices matter or fail to matter, but they are real. And no character's agency is overridden so that another character can deliver a thesis statement about the nature of resistance. The Rose and Finn scene inverts that principle completely. An act of agency is interrupted. A thesis is delivered. The interruption produces no consequence beyond the speech. The speech produces no consequence the remainder of the film tracks. And the tactical objective the interrupted act was aimed at fails immediately after the interruption. So the net mechanical result is that one more V4XD ski speeder was destroyed. One speech was delivered, and the cannon fired anyway. Johnson's creative intent was moral complexity for Finn's arc. Moral complexity in a battle sequence requires the moral problem to have a consequence the story can follow. At Hoth, every moral problem has consequences. Dak's death is tracked. Luke flies alone. It matters. The generator's destruction is tracked. The evacuation countdown accelerates. It matters. At Crait, the interrupted sacrifice has no tracked consequence. The speech has no tracked consequence. The scene borrowed the structural shape of a sacrifice sequence, the committed run, the stakes, the cost, and replaced the sacrifice's resolution with a collision and a line of dialogue, and then didn't follow the line anywhere. General Veers destroyed the shield generator from inside his personal AT-AT. He targeted the generator building directly and held fire until the shot was certain. The building collapsed. The shield dropped. With the deflector field gone, the second phase activated. The V-150 ion cannon opened fire on the Imperial blockade in coordinated salvos, disabling star destroyers and clearing a corridor. The GR-75 transport ships launched with fighter escort through that window. The sequencing of the Hoth evacuation follows a chain the film established before the battle started. Shield generator keeps the Empire on the ground. If the generator falls, the shield falls. If the shield falls, the ion cannon creates the escape window. If the window opens, the transports go. Each step is downstream of the previous one, and each step was put in place before the battle began. Nothing is invented at the moment it's needed. The resolution uses pieces that were already there. Afterward, the Rebel Alliance adopted Tactical Plan 18, a new operational security protocol requiring each captain to scatter to different corners of the galaxy rather than use predetermined rendezvous points. The Alliance had been found once by a systematic search. They changed their procedures in direct response. They lost Hoth and adapted. The defeat was survivable because the organization survived it, and surviving organizations change behavior. Luke's arc out of Hoth pointed toward 3 more films. He survived the battle, escaped with Han, trained with Yoda on Dagobah, confronted Vader at Cloud City, eventually stood in the Emperor's throne room. The Battle of Hoth was a chapter in his story. Expensive, formative, but a chapter. The man who improvised under fire on Hoth was still becoming who he needed to be. The Battle of Crait ends with Luke Skywalker dying. During the entire ground engagement, the ski speeder sortie, the cannon breach, the First Order entering the base, the confrontation on the Salt Flat, Luke was physically on Ahch-To, a different planet, a different star system. He projected a real-time image of himself across interstellar space using a force technique called force projection, which requires, by canonical description, extreme concentration and focus. The projection was detailed enough to interact with the environment and convince Kylo Ren's forces that it was real. Kylo ordered the entire First Order assault to open fire on it. The walkers fired. The cannons fired. Luke stood in the salt and took it all, untouched, because there was nothing physical there to touch. Force projection, a Jedi manifesting a real-time interactive image of themselves across interstellar distances, appears nowhere in Star Wars canon before this moment. Not in the prequel trilogy, not in the original trilogy, not in any other entry in the sequel trilogy. The technique is introduced in The Last Jedi as the resolution to a battle that couldn't be resolved by any established means, used once, and retired when it kills its user. Kylo Ren advanced and attempted to fight the projection directly. Luke absorbed every blow without damage and returned none, not because of defensive skill, but because there was nothing physical there to damage. The clues that something unusual was happening were present for attentive viewers. Luke's hair was the wrong color. His lightsaber was a weapon destroyed earlier in the film. These details function as post hoc evidence once the explanation arrives, and as the projection bought time, the surviving Resistance members followed a Crystal Fox's path through a cave passage and reached the Millennium Falcon outside the mountain. Then Luke let the concentration break. He died on Ahch-To. The contrast with the Hoth ending is structurally precise. Hoth's resolution, ion cannon fires, corridor clears, transports escape, uses mechanisms the screenplay established before the battle began. The ion cannon was part of Echo Base's defensive architecture. The GR-75 transports were the evacuation fleet. The Imperial blockade was the obstacle the ion cannon was designed to address. Nothing is invented at the moment of resolution. The pieces were in place. At Crait, the resolution is a force technique with no prior precedent, deployed once, fatal to its user, that buys time for barely a dozen survivors to reach a single ship. The Rebel Alliance emerged from Hoth as a functioning military organization that adapted operationally and continued fighting for years. The Resistance emerged from Crait as a remnant, fewer people than would fill a conference room, on one vessel, dependent on Luke Skywalker having spent himself completely on something that had never been done before. Luke's arc out of Crait does not point forward. He died. The man who improvised his way through Hoth, who adapted under fire, survived, and became the protagonist of 2 more films, died transmitting a hologram across star systems because the battle Rian Johnson constructed had no other exit. Rian Johnson wrote and directed The Last Jedi. Every creative decision examined here is his. He directed the sequence where the First Order advanced walkers across a salt flat toward a rebel base, without a scene establishing why orbital bombardment wasn't used. He worked with Kevin Jenkins to design the AT-M6 with the explicit goal of making the original AT-AT look small, and then built a battle that gave the AT-M6 less narrative function than the machine it was designed to surpass. He constructed the Rose and Finn scene with the stated intent of adding moral complexity to Finn's arc. He introduced force projection as the resolution to a battle his screenplay had no other way to end, and used it to retire the franchise's most consequential legacy character. Disney acquired Lucasfilm in October 2012, bringing Kathleen Kennedy into the president's role at the studio. The sequel trilogy was produced without a shared story outline across directors. J.J. Abrams set the foundation in The Force Awakens. Johnson took the second film in the direction he independently chose. Abrams returned for The Rise of Skywalker and navigated the consequences. The The structural incoherence of the trilogy as a whole is the product of that creative arrangement. 3 directors making sequential, independent decisions in a franchise where decisions compound across films. The production scale of The Last Jedi is reported at figures in the hundreds of millions of dollars. The exact number is disputed across different accounts, but the scale isn't in doubt. What that scale establishes is that the failures in the Crait battle aren't resource failures. The DSS-02 shield generator, the mechanism that made Hoth work, was invented by Lawrence Kasdan and Lee Brackett. It's a sentence in a screenplay. It costs nothing to write a reason for the First Order's fleet to hold above Crait. It costs nothing to write a tactical problem specific to the ATM-6's design that a character has to solve. It costs nothing to let Finn's run complete and let the story live or die by the result. These are writing decisions. They have no budget. Empire Strikes Back was made for approximately $18 million in 1980. What made it work was that the writers asked why before they showed what. The shield answers why the Empire can't bombard from orbit. The AT-AT's geometry answers why the Rebels' cannons fail. The tow cable answers why improvisation beats doctrine when it's specific enough. The ion cannon answers how the evacuation stays possible. Every visual in the Hoth battle has a reason underneath it, and the reasons connect to each other in a chain that runs from the probe droid's discovery to the last transport clearing the blockade. The case rests on all 4 exhibits together. Hoth has an 80-kilometer orbital shield that forces a ground assault, creating the entire downstream logic of the battle. Crait has a steel door, and no explanation for why the First Order didn't fire from orbit. The AT-AT's simple 4-legged geometry communicated its threat and its vulnerability in the same image. The ATM-6's gorilla knuckle configuration explains its engineering visibly, while doing less narrative work than the vehicle it was built to replace. The tow cable tactic was improvised standard equipment, repurposed under fire at a cost. Dak killed, Luke's aircraft destroyed, 1 walker down, battle still lost. The 13V-4XD ski speeders launched, produced red salt trails, destroyed nothing, and retreated. At Hoth, characters made sacrifices, and the battle tracked the consequences. At Crait, the central sacrifice was interrupted for a speech, while the objective being targeted was breached in the background. Hoth ended with the Rebel Alliance intact and adapting. Crait ended with Luke Skywalker dead from a force technique with no prior existence in canon, and barely a dozen survivors on 1 ship. The Hoth battle is load-bearing at every joint. Pull the shield generator, and the Empire fires from orbit, and the walkers never march. Pull the AT-AT's 4-legged geometry, and the tow cable solution disappears. Pull the tow cable, and Luke's alternative assault on the downed walker has no contrast. Pull the ion cannon, and the evacuation window never opens. Every piece holds up another piece. At Crait, the visual elements are present, and the connective logic isn't. Walkers advance for no explained reason. Speeders provide imagery rather than tactics. The sacrifice is interrupted before it can resolve. The hero arrives from another planet using an unprecedented ability. The chain that holds Hoth together at every joint is missing from Crait, and the gap is visible at every point of comparison. Rian Johnson had an enormous budget, the most beloved franchise in cinema, and a 37-year-old template for exactly the battle he was making. He replicated its appearance and lost the structure underneath. The red salt trails are beautiful. The ATM-6 is an engineering achievement. The force projection sequence is visually,